Internet inequality. Access to internet on a Native American reservation. The problem. Internet inequality among Native American tribal students renders them unable to access educational opportunities. The question becomes, how do we get internet to these communities so that students have the opportunities they deserve? Most Native American reservations lack adequate internet access. This affects life on the reservation in many different ways. The way it affects education is extremely important. This has been an ongoing issue for tribes across the nation, but the COVID pandemic brought to light that the issue of access to internet was very significant for this population of students. According to the Society for Research in Child Development, over 1/3 of American Indian Alaska Native children live in households without broadband internet access, the highest of all groups, and 15% live in homes without a computer. Both access issues are further compounded with rural residents. This is a fact that needs to be considered when we think about e-learning. When the COVID pandemic shut physical school buildings down, the assumed answer was e-learning. One major issue ended up being that most students did not have access or adequate access to a device. Most schools solved that issue by issuing their own devices for students to use. This did not fully solve the problem, though, as most of those students also did not have access to the internet to use the device provided to them. Hotspots were purchased by school districts, but they quickly found they did not have enough to cover the number of families who needed the hotspots. It's helpful to understand the background of life on a Native American reservation when thinking about why internet access is inadequate. According to Emily Donnellan from the American Indian Law Journal, as of 2017, 5.4 million Native Americans and Alaska Natives are living in the United States. Of those 5.4 million, 23% live below the poverty level. The unemployment rate on reservation across the nation in 2017 was 50%. Due to these conditions, many families cannot afford internet service from big-name internet providers, nor can they afford the device needed to access. In 2010, the U.S. Census found that 22% of Native Americans live on tribal lands, the places where getting internet services is the hardest. On those lands, 85% of residents lacked fixed broadband services at that time. Analysis of the problem. We can look to history first to help explain the conditions on reservations nationwide. Life on reservation is affected by cultural trauma. Donnellan states that cultural trauma refers to a history of forced relocation, societal prejudice, and systematic genocide. Some of the issues are ongoing, like the fact that many students live in multi-generational homes. They may be living with aunts and uncles, cousins, or grandparents. In a situation like that, there may be no space for a formal learning environment. Each student needs a device to access their schoolwork, which means many multi-generational homes do not have enough devices to go around. Many low-income families rely on schools to provide lunch and breakfast for free. Without school-provided meals, some families would not be able to feed their children adequately. It's also not uncommon for a student to have a very long bus ride to and from school when they live on a reservation. A more recent report from the Federal Communications Commission in 2015 reports that 63% of residents on tribal lands lack access to broadband services. Though this number has gone down since the 2010 census findings, it's still extremely high. Cultural rules related to how and when a cell tower can be built on reservation must be observed. Tribal leaders must be included in any plans for or construction of service towers on tribal lands. Reservations tend to be very large pieces of land that are not very populated. The housing on reservations tends to be low income in a lot of cases. We should also keep in mind that tribal elders resist the idea of this type of technology advancement. They have concerns that it will threaten the preservation of their community's history and culture. All of these pieces work together to create the problem we have of internet being inadequate on Native American reservations. Significant aspects of this problem. When considering how to solve this issue, it's important to consider some aspects of cultural learning. Considering a student's cultural background is part of designing curriculum and should also be considered when creating a plan to roll out education to Native American students on reservations. It's particularly important to consider when that education plan is related to online learning. We should keep in mind that students benefit from learning about their own culture. Connecting with elders allows them to learn their native languages, learn cultural practices, and strengthen life skills. These are not necessarily things that would take place in an e-learning environment, but should be encouraged and included. Benefit to e-learning is that students seem to be particularly interested in sharing their own culture and learning about other students' cultures. As previously mentioned, life on reservation comes with many cultural traumas for many families. A way to buffer that is for American Indian Alaska Native children to maintain connections with their culture, participate in ceremonies, dance at powwows, and maintain those connections with extended family. These aspects affect how we can make e-learning work for Native American students. The main issue is about getting internet connectivity to these communities so that they can participate in e-learning. However, we cannot solve that issue without understanding these significant aspects of learning for Native Americans. Options for action. One possible initiative to help solve the problem would be to use cell phone service instead of broadband internet services. In this solution, cell phones and/or hotspots would be used. The devices would be supplied to families who qualify. A big question here is who would fund the devices. Another solution, though much more of a long-term goal, would be to increase the number of Native American IT professionals. IT professionals within the tribal communities would be best fit to make decisions about how digital tools should be employed and used in those communities. This solution would also help prepare students to succeed in a world that is more and more technology forward. Those professionals could then go on to work with tribal governments on ways to implement education and training for Native individuals, therefore increasing the number of IT professionals on the reservation. IT professionals could then work with other IT professionals from other minority groups to find ways to meet technological needs for their communities. If the goal is to get access to internet and devices, and the main problem is funding, then increasing support for students through federal programs could help. Increasing funding for programs that allow students to participate in cultural, language, academic, and dropout prevention programs could also end up funding internet connection, if connection is available in the area. These studies argue that internet should be provided to these communities at no or low cost to them. That would include the cost of building towers in areas that did not already have them. This is another initiative that has a big question about where the funding would come from. Many native reservations bring in revenue from casinos on their tribal land. Unfortunately, not every reservation has the means to build a casino. For those reservations that have access to internet at some locations, online gambling could be an answer. Congress could grant tribes the authority to operate internet gambling facilities. Even on reservations where internet is severely limited, the tribes could use the income from that facility to fund greater internet infrastructure advancement. To start, only one building would need internet access. Finally, there is the option of leaving most of the work to the teachers. Teachers would follow a model similar to the COVID procedures that were followed for getting work to students. This would be for communities who have very limited internet access. Most of the work would be done in paper packets, which would be delivered to students via bus routes that also delivered breakfast and lunch. Then the student could meet virtually with the teacher at a location that has internet, like a local library, to get extra help. Most of the initiatives presented have drawbacks. Some notes of caution to consider are the generation gap. Tribal elders have concerns that the internet will expose the younger generations to inappropriate images. Considering this, it's important to include the tribal leaders when developing infrastructure plans for internet on reservations. When considering offering no or low cost internet, it's important to note that it was considered a major drawback. In many areas where internet is provided at no or low cost, the practice is just not sustainable. When considering any initiative, it's important to differentiate the solution. No two reservations are exactly alike, and no one solution will work for all reservations. When assessing how an initiative is working, it might be helpful to consider the local context of each reservation. Tribal rules must be observed. It shows respect when communities and families are involved in developing curriculum and how it will be delivered to the student. Observing and respecting the local culture helps to develop that sense of belonging. Probably the biggest issue with internet on reservations is that the conditions make it difficult. Most reservations are characterized by large pieces of land with low population. The housing and population tends to be low income and mainly rural. It can be very hard to convince internet companies to install towers or fiber optic cables in areas where they do not feel they will make much money. Though cell phone coverage is another option, not every reservation has adequate cell phone coverage from any major carrier. Recommended actions. The action that may solve this issue most efficiently would be the use of spectrum. Spectrum refers to radio waves or airwaves that we use every day to watch TV, use the internet, use our cell phone, etc. The spectrum is split into bands that are allocated by the Federal Communications Commission for specific uses. In order to get access to these bands, an individual, tribal agency, or company must apply and meet certain criteria for the band they are applying for access to. The educational broadband service is a 2.5 gigahertz band set aside for educational and radio use. The Havasupai tribe in Arizona is located at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It can only be accessed by foot, mule, or helicopter. They were granted a temporary license to use the educational broadband service. It was paid for by a nonprofit known as MuralNet. It began as a way to help high school students get their GED, considering the tribe does not offer education over 8th grade. In 2019, they were granted a permanent license to the band so that they could support a new Head Start building for low-income infants, toddlers, pregnant women, and their families. This is a great framework and example of how it could work in even the most remote of reservations. The Federal Communications Commission's opened up a tribal priority window that allows tribal nations to receive licenses for unassigned EBS spectrum on their lands. This had never been offered before. Normally, spectrum bands are auctioned off when they become available. The window is now closed. However, many tribes took advantage of this. If there were another window to open up for tribes who did not get a chance to take advantage, that could help get internet to more reservations. Tribes that are not ready to take on constructing their own network could lease their band to a service company. In conclusion, internet access on reservations is limited due to many reasons. This affects how Native American students can access educational opportunities online. There are many possible solutions being considered, but they all have drawbacks and many aspects to consider. Culture plays a key role in this because culture dictates how technology is used and how land is used. Careful consideration must be given to respecting culture when designing plans to set up internet infrastructure on tribal lands, even for educational purposes. The recommendation is to use RF waves. The FCC should allow tribal nations to obtain licenses to the EBS band of spectrum. Once accessed, tribes would have the choice of leasing the band out to a company to build their infrastructure for them, or they could build their own infrastructure. In that case, the resources needed should be provided. The Gila River Indian Telecommunications Company offers voice and broadband services to the Gila River Indian community. This service is offered to every resident on the reservation. Gila River used the CARES Act implemented to help communities recover from COVID to receive funding. They used that funding to install wireless internet and mobile hotspot vehicles. The idea has spread, and many other ideas based upon mobile hotspots are being developed. The Gila River Telecommunications Company is a great framework for future reservation-created internet providers. Internet companies created by tribal communities would not only provide internet to their communities, but also bring in revenue directly to the reservation. Thank you for listening.